yourselves because that's kind of the point of the panel. But we have Rosa, Rebekah, and Lucas who have kindly agreed to share thoughts on why they joined Platypus. So, why did you join Platypus? What has this decision meant for you? How has your relationship to the left changed since you joined? What initiatives have you been involved in recently? What did you learn in that process about yourself, about the left, about Platypus? Okay, so first, Rosa.
Rosa, do I have to introduce myself?
Yes, I'm Rosa, I'm from New York.
Okay, hi. I'm Rosa, New York chapter, from Brazil though, so yeah. I guess I'm just gonna read this thing. I think it's useful to start my remarks stating my relationship to the left pre and post Platypus, what I learned about myself, the left, and Platypus, as those are directly related to why ultimately I decided to join the organization. I've been a part of the activist left for a few years with a very actionist view of things, without any concept whatsoever of history in my dealing with social struggles. People are oppressed and the conditions of people's lives need to be ameliorated, so just focus on that. From this experience, I acquired some symptoms: anti-Americanism, feminism, and authoritarianism. I think that those represent a great part of the left milieu that I am mostly in contact with, namely the Gen Z left and the new left academia world. So joining Platypus made me realize the non-identity between what I preached and what I did. So before I get into why exactly I joined Platypus, I wanted to briefly mention the activities I've been involved with since I became a member. In New York, I lead the new school in the NYU chapter with Theo, where we've successfully established the tripod, I'd say. I've been involved in organizing a few panels, recently including the Ukraine panels, both in New York City, and the first left engagement panel in Brazil. And I've been collaborating with people from both New York and other chapters in the forthcoming iterations of the abolition panel. And I guess I also helped organize this convention. I think that the engagements with the American left, although I will be very honest, they may not interest me as much, have really gotten me interested in understanding how everything that I am learning here applies in the different, but in the end, the same conditions of where I'm from. My leftism and political ideology more generally are highly influenced by the fact that I'm from Brazil, of course. But so why did I join Platypus? I think it's fair to say that coming to the US 5 years ago and moving to South Carolina really pushed me to the anti-American left. And minoring in women's and gender studies got me further into the feminist movement. Similarly, taking classes with and working with the Democrats fueled my authoritarianism, namely anti-free speechism and overall intolerance to diverging views. I remember how my first college paper was on how the US needed to become state capitalist. In my academic milieu, capitalist politics of redistribution and taxation of the rich was what Marxism meant. To me, that was what Marxism meant. When I got invited to go to the Platypus reading group, I was referred to it by my advisor who knew that I was a Marxist. So let's just say that I really struggled with the reading group. Although I tried to attribute it to the fact that I got in the middle of the syllabus, the truth was that none of it really made sense to me. How did the party and revolution talks have any relation to my activist-based electoral politics and my academic condescendence about what is absolutely right or wrong? Lenin did not make sense to me. When we got into the critical theory weeks, things started to appear a little less opaque to me. At minimum, now the philosophical language could make more sense to me. I am a philosophy student. The question of theory and practice touched a spot in my philosophical journey that I couldn't easily let go of. So this initial taste of critical theory that I got, along with my philosophy background, got me interested in the negative dialectics reading group. The question of the relationship between philosophy and politics struck with my own previous discontents with philosophy. I had always been concerned that philosophy was not really touching base with reality, and Adorno represented that thought to me, in a sense. Although, of course, what I understood by it in the past was not what I now understand of it after Adorno. But nevertheless, Adorno helped me seeing why it was that Lenin didn't make sense to me. Adorno talked in a more familiar language to me, and he put things into perspective in a way that I could finally understand. In a way, Adorno made me make sense of Lenin, however negatively. With Adorno, Marxism finally started making sense to me. So that's when I understood what my own criticisms and discontents with philosophy really meant. And that's when I found out that there was something that could potentially be done about it. The death of philosophy made sense to me. Now I could start understanding what politics was about, but through its theoretical expression in philosophy. And one thing that really matters to me, though, that I really wanted to share is the relationship between my joining and Chris Catrone. And I'm going to admit I am saying this solely because of the current discussions on the issue of Catronism and Platypus's dependence on Chris Catrone. Chris once said something, I think on the Pedagogues call, that struck with me in terms of why I joined Platypus and something that I've learned in this process. And because he said that he's only here because there were people that wanted to learn Marxism from him. And so that really represented what I saw in Platypus. All my peers were there teaching me as long as I wanted to hear it. The effort of the people in Platypus that I've had the pleasure of encountering is indeed why I joined Platypus and why I'm committed to the project as it is. Because we're here to teach Marxism as long as there are those that want to learn it. My point is that the figure of Chris Catrone was not at all part of the rationale in me joining Platypus. And the reason why I wanted to share this in these initial remarks is that I find this debate on the possibility of Platypus without Chris and see this seeming dependence of the project in his leading figure very interesting. But that's only so because in my experience, Platypus was never about Chris Catrone, per se. Platypus's scope seems to point beyond Catronism. I joined Platypus because of the several peers in the project that have helped me through it. Took time and patience to answer my questions, took time to teach me what I wanted to learn, and helped me develop my teaching skills. But to conclude, I think that if I had to say in one sentence why I joined Platypus, I'd say that I joined Platypus simply because I want to change the world. I have not yet resigned. Thank you.
Hello?
Do you turn it on?
Hello? Go up. Oh no. Yeah, go up.
Yeah,
Hello?
no.
Oh, hi everyone.
Yeah, you're good.
Hi. To be honest, this whole weekend's been really overwhelming. I spent the last I was surprised when Efraim asked me to be on this panel because I've been in Platypus for about 2 years, officially. I encountered it around 3 years ago, and I did something which actually, talking to people, it seems happens a lot, is I kind of had this initial interest where I was fighting it a lot for about 6 months, and then I decided to quit Platypus. And then 3 months later I was like, fuck, they're right, okay. And then I had another kind of 5-6 months, and then I became a member. But again, as I said, that happened about 2 years ago. I remember refreshing the list, or refreshing my emails to see if I'd be joined to the list like late February 2020. So 2 months later, it was the lockdown, and my first convention was online. So it's been overwhelming in that I feel like I know all of you through the list, through Facebook, through the online convention, and it's great to see all of you. It's an experience, but I'm quite sensitive to these things, so it's trying to get my head straight. I want to commit like an awful faux pas and start with a quote. So this is from Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, which I read when I led my first reading group, which was the Art and Politics reading group. So, if then a young friend of the true and of the beautiful, I'm trying not to cry, if then a young friend of the true and the beautiful were to ask me how.
Don't cry.
Good, the same thing, that's fine, that's great, that's okay.
No Schiller.
No Schiller, got it. Too bourgeois. So I'm going to kind of pick up the first and last sentence from this paragraph because it's quite long. If then a young friend of the true and of the beautiful were to ask me how, notwithstanding the resistance of the times, he can satisfy the noble longing of his heart, I should reply, direct the world on which you act towards that which is good, and the measured and peaceful course of time will bring about the results. This is pre-contradiction of bourgeois society. You have given it this direction by your teaching. You raise its thoughts towards the necessary and the eternal. If by your acts or your creations you make the necessary and the eternal the object of your learnings, the structure of error of all that is arbitrary must fall, and it has already fallen as soon as you are sure that it is tottering. But it is important that it should only totter in the external, but also in the internal man. Cherish triumphant truth in the modest sanctuary of your heart. Give it an incarnate form through beauty, that I may not only be the understanding that does homage to it, but that feeling may lovingly grasp its appearance, and that you may not by any chance take from external reality the model which you yourself ought to furnish. Do not venture into its dangerous society before you are assured in your own heart that you have a good escort furnished by ideal nature. And this is the bit I want to emphasize. Live with your age, but be not its creation. Labor for your contemporaries, but do for them what they need and not what they praise. And to finish it off, I'm going to do a much shorter quote from Adorno's Reflection on Class Theory. The ever new is also the old lying close at hand. The new does not add itself to the old, but remains the old in distress in its hour of need. I joined Platypus when I understood that lesson. So my first introduction to the left was in high school. I was about 16, 17, and I read Owen Jones's The Establishment and How to Get Away with It. So Owen Jones is kind of like a Labourite, writes for The Guardian. If you are in the UK and you're mildly leftist, you know who Owen Jones is. And he published this in 2014, kind of reflecting on the Cameron Conservative government. And what he did was kind of draw a straight line from Thatcher to David Cameron's Conservative government, which was elected in the wake of the 2000 financial aid crisis. And he explained, and Owen Jones is explaining the crisis of his time as the further consolidation of neoliberalism, right? So austerity, so more cronyism and privatization, assured by a revolving door of power between political, financial, and media elites. And this is how I came to understand Brexit as well. So although it was a while ago, I struggled to kind of and I don't think I really had any clear thoughts, but kind of, and kind of I'll get to the point of this later. But for Brexit, for me, it was a cynical movement that would use reactionary nationalism to implement further austerity, financialization, and crony capitalism, and that the British public were duped by the capitalist-controlled media and British imperial chauvinism. So around this time, I also was really into Tumblr. I'm very much Gen Z in that my political education came from the internet. So I kind of joined progressive Mormon blogs, because at the time I was a Mormon. Got very into kind of the LGBTQ rights and feminism. It kind of opened this world to a very insular childhood that I had. Also occurring about this time is the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party, which I only understood the significance of once I went into the university. Once I kind of made friends with like British leftists. So I encountered so I had kind of like my first year of university doing a sociology degree. And I really related to what you were saying, Rosa, in that it's very, it's gender, race, and sociological class. And you start to learn like very, like a very bitter kind of like, in the UK it's anti-Britishness, but also anti-Americanness, that is prevailing. And just kind of angry all the time. And I was even angrier because I'd broken up with my boyfriend who was like a conservative. And I was just like, okay, I'm guilty. I like dated a guy that liked Jordan Peterson. So to repent for my sins, I joined Antifa. I did postering. Well, actually, it was interesting because actually it was the face of Charlottesville. So it was a student who participated in the Charlottesville Tiki Torch protest. Was accepted into a master's program at LSE, and that was actually like a big thing for the whole school. And actually, that is when like the left started becoming like a thing for me. Right, that's when I was like, yes, I'm a leftist, I'm like radical. It's also when I started engaging in like left tube, so like ContraPoints, Philosophy Tube, H. Bomber Guy. Again, it was like extremely online, but this is the education. This is how I got into it, and my friends were, telling me about Corbyn, and then I joined Antifa, and I went on like a counter protest to a alt-right rally, and the counter protest outnumbered them like probably 20 to 1. And it was later that week that I did my first coffee break. And I don't know if we've recalled this, if I'm recalling it correctly. I think we have like different recollections of how this happened. But I distinctly remember like sitting down with Dominic, who I was flirting with, and that was part of the reason I came to the coffee break. And Efraim sat down at the table, and Ephraim's like, okay, so what's your deal? And I was like, oh, well, I'm a leftist. I just did a protest. And he was like, so why would you go on a protest? Or he's like, but not in the mean way, but he was just like, tell me about it. It's like, why did you do this? And he just kept questioning me, and I found myself not being able to really give him a straight answer. And that was interesting. And I think along the same time, we just talked about Marxism. It's like, what do you know about Marxism? What do you understand about it? And that's when the concept of freedom was introduced into my understanding of Marxism. Which again, this was like about a year after I left Mormonism, and I was having a conversation with one time about Mormonism. But like, freedom is like this weird thing that exists in the Mormon consciousness. It's kind of like this weird like American bourgeois ideal that's then like theologized. And I was like, oh, freedom, that's a bit weird. But also like it kind of spoke to me in a almost nostalgic way. And that was really interesting. It had never been posed to me for like that, and that's what got me into it. But I fought a lot with the material. So actually, I remember the first PR, David. It was your article on trans. The millennial sex panic. Actually, it was both of them, and I was like, this is a right-wing cult. I was just like. I was like, David, how could you say these things? Especially knowing that you had recruited the people at the chapter. So that really kind of freaked me out. Why not Trump? Also really freaked me out. I was like, where are the citations? Which I've come to appreciate. Adorno has a great essay on why you shouldn't cite everything. But I fought with it constantly, and I ended up giving up on Platypus. It was too much of a thorn in the side of my undergraduate sociology degree. I developed a frustratingly nuanced views about the Enlightenment, which didn't sit well for my post-colonial social theory class. And besides, I really couldn't afford to declare that the left was dead because I was on the verge of making a breakthrough sociological study about the left-wing counter-hegemony flourishing on YouTube. So I was like, I also had concerns about how much the project demanded from people. So actually at the time, this was during a time in Platypus where actually it really demanded a lot from people. So Dom was not only carrying the responsibilities of the chapter, but he had to do constant reports, constant meetings, and I was a bit concerned for him. Like it was difficult seeing, somebody that I loved, kind of like putting so much into it, and I didn't really understand why. And I remember, so I was like, okay, I'm quitting Platypus. I'm not, I need to take a break from it, kind of rethink it. I remember passing by like you and Dom and Rory having drinks, and you guys were like, oh, do you want to hang out? And I was like, no, I'm not doing Platypus anymore, guys. But, like about 2 months later, I found myself starting to read Trotsky for the Stalinism, like summer reading group. But really, where Platypus really clicked, and this is kind of where I've already gone through like a few members. So Dominic was kind of like my first point of contact. Efraim, Rory Padraig, actually, because you were there at the time, and Evan Odell. I started, Evan Odell was doing the reading group, and he's someone that can really like be really provocative and kind of like make you think. But really, and I'm sorry for going on, guys. I know my time's probably up soon, but really the point where it clicked was the 2019 election and Ephraim's teaching on labor and the left. And what clicked and I actually can't remember, and I need to look, whether this was before, I think it was before the election. And the history, both the macro history and the micro history of the British left's relationship to labor was laid out to me in a way that had never been approached before, because it's tabooed, right? It's like this idea of failure is heavily tabooed in the British left. And I remember, you showing like one of these political cartoons, labor paves the way. And the assumption is paves the way for socialism, or at least we project that, but really it's paves the way for liberalism, for the Liberal Party. And it was only kind of when I read Lenin in the following year that I really kind of consolidated what it meant, but it was that lesson that the left becomes the basis for the reconstitution of capitalism in its crisis. And that was absolutely the case when Jeremy Corbyn lost the election. And I saw that in history, and I saw this like crazy inertia of consciousness. And I was like, okay, Platypus are doing something that nobody else is doing, because they're the only ones that kind of kept their head and like helped me actually really think through what was happening during the Labour election when all my friends were just like losing it or just become despondent, right? It's like that's, as I remember, it was just like a turn to anti-imperialism and anti-fascism, and everyone was just angry and didn't know what to do. I think this maybe prefigured a little bit like the Bernie thing as well. So like we experienced it in the UK a few months before Bernie Sanders lost the primary elections. But it was like this massive downturn that like I just couldn't, it was just hard to get my head around. Also coinciding, like Pam came over for, I think you were doing some research, but having like a founding member kind of come over and like talk to me and give me her time and just like really talk me through what I was thinking was really useful for that as well. And that was also a key part of my recruitment. And the kind of, I want to say the left is history, the left is history? The rest is history. So kind of like the next week I asked Efraim, who ran the coffee breaks at the time, I want to do all of Trump. So I said, why not Trump? Why wish Hillary had run, and why not Trump again? Because I think I'd just come at that point. And like I got it. Like I wasn't fighting it anymore. Like I understood how useful it was as a pedagogical tool. And it's only kind of working with Chris when I became a pedagogue, like that clarification of pedagogy and like just good teaching was just incredible to me. One of the main lessons I learned from Chris is, and I remember he actually sent this in an email, but it's throughout all his work, it's be dialectical, be speculative, and be generous. Just being generous with the material that you're given. And that's there's no space for that. Right, we live in a highly authoritarian time, Gen Z specific, like especially. We're not allowed to think generously, speculatively, or dialectically. So it was a unique space where I could actually try to think through this turn in history. Maybe to end it off. So I went through the membership packet with Rory. He's been a very key aspect of my recruitment as well, and I'm very grateful for that. And again, I then became a pedagogue last year. So I've done it once. I'm now kind of halfway through again, and that's where I am. What's this decision meant for me? I think it's just meant that I feel that I'm on the path to finding back that meaning to modernity. You know, it's like the second Enlightenment kind of things, and there's nothing more that scares me, but also gives me so much hope than like doing work for this project, and that's where I'll end it.
Hello. Yeah. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I am a bit underprepared right now, so please forgive me for that. But I actually was similarly terminally online, just not on Tumblr, more like lefty pole, you know. No, lefty pole, not stupid pole. I'm not a Redditor. How can you insult me like that? But actually, so that was one thing, but also just like, you know, that's the great thing about the age of the internet. You have all the PDFs, all the texts all around, Marxist.org, of course, and all the weird sects also usually have their texts online. So that was basically my previous engagement with the left, i.e. reading Marx and Lenin on Marxist.org, just like completely out of context, but just also reading like whatever some German groups, you know, write as their position or whatever. And so I went through like just being a nerd for like 1 year or so before I went to Frankfurt University and encountered Platypus. And so why did I join Platypus could be answered in this case very simply, because let's divide that into subjective and objective factors. Subjectively, I was already completely exhausted by my own autodidacticism. You know, I just like I've gone through everything, like in my head, you know. Just I've never been active on anything, but just like I had at least, I guess, this a bit of an open mind when I read this position, and I just thought that is complete nonsense. But then, wait, they have a point, but like on their own it's one-sided, and if I take this other position I can't really add it up, but like, you know, it's so that was like my exhaustion already, and like utter confusion. I just didn't know what to do with all this stuff that I just fed through my brain. And so that I was really like ripe for Platypus, you know, because objectively Platypus was the only serious place for, you know, a theory nerd like me. The other place would have been the local Gegenstandpunkt, I guess. And if you want to have a look at an actual guru organization, you have to look at the Gegenstandpunkt. It is like 3,000 members, 3,000 Peter Deckers. Like they sound the same, they write the same, they talk the same way. Like it's impressive, you know. Yeah, so I either would have ended up there, but I ended up in Platypus. And I actually just went through 6 weeks of the reading group and going to the coffee break, and I said, that's great, let me become a member, you know. So I got into Platypus a bit faster than my co-panelists, I guess.
Kudos.
So what has this meant, joining Platypus? it has meant learning, just a whole lot of learning and reading, clearing up all of the confusions I've had, understanding also where the contemporary left, like where they come from, you know, like how this group came out of this tradition and so on, understanding their genesis, you know, and the relationship, how it changed to the left. Like, first of all, the first actual engagements with like leftism now, like except for like knowing people on Twitter or Discord, I had no previous actual engagement with the left. So Platypus was the place where, you know, I went to left events and so on. You know, like the first event was, I guess, the Norfight event, which was pretty funny because my recruiter, kind of, you know, Platypus recruiter, Platypus member Henning, just really the guy from the Norfights was like really. I said the guy's name. He's like the chairman of the German Norfights, Ulrich Rippert. And after this event, I said, you know, Ulrich the Ripper just ripped you apart. You know, he was a funny man. But the other thing, actually, when I thought a bit about, like, you know, preparing for this whole thing, actually what also has changed, that I'm like really, like, I don't think before I was just like, when I like read and like was terminally online, but now in Platypus I'm really angry at the left, actually, all the time. But I hope that is like, you know, the Adorno quote, Denken hat die Wut sublimiert. I hope, you know, thinking sublimates the rage or something in English, in resignation, you know, the sentence. So I hope that's like what happens in Platypus to me, but maybe you've seen that yesterday.
You're working on it.
Yeah, that's my like anger issues, you know. So and now quickly, what initiatives I have been engaged since I became a member in December 2019. First of all, I've led, of course, the reading group, both the what is Marxism, what is the left, what is revolutionary Marxism, and I've organized the what is the legacy of the German Communist Party panel. I was in the committee for that one. It has been published, transcribed and published in the new German PR. And I moderated that panel also. And I've also been involved in transcribing some interviews and being the chapter head of Frankfurt for the last semester. And of course, two other things would be being doing my anti-fascism and the left teaching, and also in that context because we also did a panel on anti-fascism in Frankfurt, and the last minute I jumped in to speak on the panel because we couldn't get the people that we wanted. So currently, when I get back from Chicago to Frankfurt, I'll assist Sebastian Vogel, a veteran of this organization, in doing an interview with Thomas von der Ostensacken, who you've maybe experienced on the International Ukraine and the Left panel, this online thing where he had this very nice and friendly conversation with Gerald Smith. And so all these, so what did you learn in that process? I can tell you something about that, and then I've got to the end then. So actually, like, I've already engaged before Thomas von der Ostensacken. He did an event in Frankfurt, and so I went there and like later talked to him in the bar and so on. But also the anti-fascism teacher, and actually really I've learned a lot about how much the anti-Deutsch, which we in Platypus have a long history, how much of an obstacle they also are. You know, we of course have this sympathy kind of with them because they have at least had this moment of like critical self-reflection, but quickly threw that out for, you know, just usual red libism. You've seen it with Thomas von der Ostensacken on the panel. It's the anti-Deutsch, just as any other left current, is also just red lips, but you know, in the US, red lips are chanting Free Palestine, and so the anti-Germans are just red lips, but they don't do that. They instead wave Israel flags. And yeah, and so like my anti-fascism teacher, and also the other thing, the last thing is also like how dead the left is, you know, like engaging with the texts of the 30s and 40s and so on seriously by Trotsky and Adorno, like not, you know, all the left reads these thinkers on fascism to get a recipe for today, you know, some sort of manual, you know, it's kind of telling that you've got this pamphlet of like this collection of texts of Trotsky, What is Fascism and How to Fight It. Very unfortunate title, you know, like a manual. And so this contrast between what is today, whatever anti-fascism means today. In Frankfurt currently it means bullying a far-right student who, but also ex-officer of the German army, who has this court case against him because of terrorism. So he's probably not a nice individual, but you know, when you don't have anything else to do, I guess you have to bully this guy. So yeah, and that the 20th century really, really like completely annihilated Marxism. Like this whole anti-fascism thing and other problems. Of course, like fascism and anti-fascism is just one aspect of the 20th century, but yeah, like it's like in today, like if you honestly talk about, let's say, Trotsky's critique of Stalinism, it also sounds completely unhinged. What does it mean? Like maybe you've read some Spartakist articles where they say don't do these popular front, white front counter demonstrations against fascists. We only need to mobilize the workers' organizations, that means the trade unions and so on. Like, what does this mean today? Like even, yeah. So yeah, the left is dead. Long live the left, and that would be my talk. Yeah.
We're going to go straight to take a couple of questions, and if you guys want to also comment on, you know, similarities and differences between the three of you in response, that's great. Padre, let's start with Justin in the red shirt.
Hi, this isn't quite a question. I wanted to briefly maybe overview, because I noticed all your presentations, sort of, I noticed some of my own history and being involved in Platypus. I just wanted to sort of give a much briefer like summary, maybe. So like when I was reading Lenin, State and Revolution for one of my first reading group sessions, my thought was that it makes so much sense, you know? So why are we still reading it, right? It almost felt too good to be true. And I think at that point I was like feeling, but wasn't knowing that I was feeling the historical discontinuity that the left has with the 20th century. So I came into contact with Platypus via YDSA in 2018, and it kind of gave me a way to digest the dechartering and subsequent liquidation of YDSA under a self-avowed Stalinist president, who at one point, when Mason's food staff went on strike, offered to a Metro DC DSA leader to have YDSA, which was then called Rose, don't know what that stands for, manage the kitchens. So I just get this image of like a bunch of sociology majors getting third-degree burns in a fryer or something. But over the course of like 2018 to 2020, I had some sort of latent postmodernism that I was getting from my academic anthropology classes, right? And this pulling me away from the education I was receiving in Platypus. I was friends with a lot of humanities and social science majors who saw Platypus as right-wing, and who also sort of had a similar educational background as I did. So I felt torn, and I really wanted to prove Platypus wrong, but eventually I gave up. And the reason why is actually, I think when I sort of resumed reading group, like in early 2020 or maybe late 2019, I read Postone. And Postone, in his sort of text that we read, forgetting the name of the moment, but he discusses Marxist critical theory as pointing to conditions of possibility for change, you know, as a sort of like link in the system that actually points to its own overcoming. And I think that was like, deep down I felt that post-structuralism, or whatever I was learning in my classes, didn't have that it was unconsciously affirmative of its moment. So I just noticed, since I've sort of been leading the reading group and being more involved in Platypus, that some of these contacts from 2018 have even come back. You know, we had Charlie back there. Yeah, there it is. Say hi. And it's been nice to sort of notice that sort of fluctuation as being potentially productive, you know? Like the ambivalence that one feels can be really productive for Platypus. So I guess I joined because I didn't want freedom to sound too good to be true anymore.
Thanks. Padre Ethan's next, down at the front here. I've got Bryce and then Lewis Haling, then Ed Remus.
Right down at the front?
Yeah. Hold on. Does anyone want to respond to Justin? Or just let it stand? Yes.
Wasn't a lot to respond.
This one?
Yeah. I think the Zoom people are having trouble hearing the current mic.
Okay.
There you go.
Padre, give me that. Go ahead, Ethan.
Okay, well, so Rebekah, you already spoke to this, so maybe our other two panelists. Let me start with Rosa. I remember we did a film screening on Rosa Luxemburg, and I said at one point that she's not a feminist, and I could tell it struck a nerve with you. And I thought maybe we'll last you forever. But if it wasn't for your patience and Daniel DeWeese's patience as well, then we might have lost you. I'm wondering, you know, if maybe you two would speak to what frustrated you at Platypus, or what confused you, and what experiences do you remember you working through that frustration and then committing to the project again?
I just have
This has to be
2
me.
cents.
I have to start.
No, go Lucas, you go.
Well, I know in the first reading group session I had this whole hang up on like the non-identity of bourgeois society and capitalism. I was like, look here, already on the Jewish question by Marx, he's like, you know, in consequence, all of these liberal ideas, you know, are contradictory already, like on a level of, you know, ideas. And so that's like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like it's consequentially that there's like, it's one line, it's straight, you know. But that quickly dissolved. I probably had some more, but as I've said, I only needed 6 weeks of the reading group, and I was already a member. So I remember one that also got quickly dissolved. I remember, and Henning later taught me, you know, I was like not really into it, but like performatively into like Kurdish stuff, you know. In Germany, that's like also another thing that the left does, because it hasn't.
Campaign for Palestine.
Yes, correct. So, but that also like was really performative and really like weak. So that also quickly got confronted about that. That in some contexts, I think a coffee break or so. And later, when I was a member, Henning asked me like, "What the fuck was going on there? You were like so smart already about like value form and so on, and then Kurdish resistance in Rojava, like why?" So yeah, that's just everything.
So yeah, I mean, in terms, I remember this. Just to start with Ethan's question, in terms of the film screening, the Rosa Luxemburg and the feminism question. I just remember how when we were in the post-movie discussion, I was like, why are we not talking about how it's only Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg? They were the only women. Like, why are we not talking about that? Like, that's what matters. And it's like...
The last 2 men.
Yeah. Last
Yeah,
two
it
men
took
or
a
so.
while to understand that was not what mattered, and so that was something that really took some time to work through, and I actually have to thank like the fact that I started doing platypus like more seriously, and then joined like my master's in New York at the New School, which is a very like Democrat called Marxist school where all the professors are Marxists and radicals, but they all hate Marx, that I started to really understand like this question of feminism and Marxism, and so it was really important to really work through this question that I'm still very interested in. But in terms of the question of what frustrated or confused me in platypus, I think that the first thing that really frustrated me, and Daniel's gonna remember this because he was really patient with me in coffee breaks and taking all my questions, but it was really clear to me that the American left was dead, but I was like, the Brazilian left is not.
Yeah, similar.
Like here, yeah, no, you don't understand how the Brazilian left is. We're doing a lot of things, you know. So that really frustrated me in the beginning, to understand how you can't really separate things like that. So really understanding the meaning of the death of the left was frustrating in the beginning, because I really had to really crash with everything that I thought was true in life. So it was really weird. But just lastly, I think something that didn't necessarily frustrate me, but it was very confusing, and it's something that Lucas was talking about, this question of bourgeois society and freedom, is because it was just very confusing to me to even talk about something like bourgeois society and freedom, because it was so foreign to me. It was a complete, like, I was actually learning this new thing completely. Like, it made no sense to me. Like, this is so right-wing. Like, like, freedom is right-wing. And so actually understanding the historical consciousness part was very confusing, but then I guess once you start working through it, it starts making much sense. So what is confusing and frustrating is actually what's helpful, the most helpful.
I would just emphasize, the last time we did this panel, the members said the same thing frustrated them: bourgeois society and freedom and stuff like that. So that's telling.
Bryce.
Well, thanks to our panelists. It takes a lot of courage to kind of deal with that, to sit with that cognitive dissonance and keep going forward. And I kind of had a question for Rosa, because I thought it was interesting that you mentioned, talking about Adorno and Lenin. And as activists, we have a different kind of set of priorities of trying to like instrumentalize things. And in Platypus, like, we ask people these questions, and in an organizing activist case, sometimes you're like, I don't ask people those questions because I want to be their friend and get them to do something. And that those instincts kind of never go away if you've been trained in them. But I was curious what you said, where you're like, I don't really get Lenin, but Adorno helped me understand Lenin. Because for me, Lenin is actually pretty straightforward. But deep down, even though it's in my own subconscious, a part of me still kind of feels like, what's the point of Adorno and all this philosophy shit? And I'm curious if you can help me understand, and like briefly or whatever. Thanks.
Just briefly on this in terms of asking questions, I think that everyone that was in the first time I went to the reading group, they knew I didn't say anything. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't, it was scary, and that is a thing of do I want to disagree? I don't know if it's proper for me to disagree, and it's also, which is part of this authoritarianism, I think. But in terms of how did Adorno help me understand Lenin, I think it's, as I said, I've had this philosophy background in which I was very discontent with philosophy, because I thought that philosophy wasn't talking about reality in terms that it wasn't talking about social struggles. Like, it wasn't talking about how people's experiences and how, you know, things actually are. It's like talking about the trolley problem isn't really, like, you're not talking about reality. Like, that's not really a choice you're making. And so having that in this activist side, which was like, we didn't really do theory that much in my activist experience. It was just like, we're just doing things. It's like, this is what's right. Like, this is what's good. We're good people and we're helping people, sort of thing. So that's why Lenin was not straightforward to me at all. I mean, I couldn't understand anything that he was saying. I couldn't understand anything that he was talking about. Like, his historical moment was it felt so different than my own that it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And then the thing is that when Adorno was bringing up to me, Adorno was bringing up why it was that Lenin didn't make sense to me, namely, like, why was it that there was this difference in historical moments? This is what Adorno was pointing out to me. I can't understand Lenin because there is this discontinuity. That's what he pointed out to me. And so that's why I thought it was really important. I mean, I told Spencer that negative dialectics sort of changed my life. It really changed, like, my philosophical. I mean, I'm really glad that was the reading that people did. I mean, I don't know if I would have been necessarily in Platypus at the time that I did join, because I joined after the negative dialectics reading group. That was what made me make sense. So I mean, in terms of, just to conclude, it's not like Adorno explained to me what Lenin was talking about, but he explained to me why it was that I couldn't understand Lenin.
That makes perfect sense. All right, Lewis.
Yeah, I was going to ask, just since this is our first convention back in person, and I think maybe for at least two of you, the first convention ever, kind of if there was anything about the convention that maybe challenged your view of Platypus or felt, surprised you, but I guess that feels a little redundant to Ethan's question, so thanks for stealing my thoughts, Ethan. But yeah, maybe you could just talk a little bit about general impressions or just feelings you had.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I had to ask people after yesterday how it compares, because it feels so different. It's one of those, when you're in a room with a lot of people, and you kind of get this when you get like regional conferences or meetups, that like the project is a lot bigger than the sum of its parts. And you get like a kind of like feedback loop going, and it feels very exciting, and you get like a real sense of like how much of a serious project this is. And I'm struggling to. What I don't want to do is jump the gun, because I'm getting that kind of like sense of like, oh, what if we can do something? And I had to kind of go back to, so yesterday I just went back to the founding members, and I was just like, I need you guys to like orientate me and just tell me how this compares to other conventions. What are we going through? Because it feels very different. As I said, it's been very psychologically, emotionally overwhelming this weekend, because it feels so different. And it feels very exciting. And I'm, despite like what I think is going to be a really tough time for the next like 2 decades. Like, I don't know. We don't know, but it's like, I think it's a possibility. But I'm like, what was that thing Aaron said on the list? I forgot who did. Or I think it was the last Orcom report. We were just made for this moment, and it really comes out when you're talking to everyone. So that's, say the in-person convention just kind of changes the whole game.
Anyone else? Lucas.
I actually was lucky enough to at least visit the January 2020 German-speaking convention in Leipzig. So that was like, if I would like compare it, it was of course smaller and, well, similarly German. But yeah, it's like, so I've had this experience kind of already, but this is it's huge, it's so when you ask about how I feel about this, overwhelmed, basically, and nothing more. Yeah.
Just quickly, well, I also had the opportunity to be in an in-person convention before because we did the East Coast convention, and so that I think maybe not have as many challenges, face many challenges right now. But just briefly, I think that the thing that it was challenging for me to go on this in-person convention after pretty much only doing Platypus online and briefly in New York, the reading group, was that I had, being with everyone in person, you sort of have to start articulating your thoughts. You're having discussions and you're talking about it, and it's actually the first opportunity to, learn from each other, really, in that sense. And that's challenging because then I know I have to, because then it's also like, oh, you're always in the back of your mind, oh, am I being wrong? Am I saying something wrong? Am I saying something right? But then it's about how it's not about that. And so that was this initial challenge, which I think, again, it's a good challenge to have. So, yeah.
I have a question mainly for Rebekah, but others might have some ideas. I'll frame it with an anecdote. I have a Gen X Bernie Sanders supporting friend who is in the DSA in the late 90s, early 2000s, so sort of pro-enlightenment, right, like that kind of phase of social democracy before the millennium wave. And she approached me last year because her 17-year-old daughter, Zoomer, had become politicized by YouTube and specifically BreadTube.
Yeah.
And my friend was very concerned about her daughter's illiberalism and knew me to be something of a liberal Marxist, if you will. And it was maybe like as a millennial generation member, it was one of the first times when I felt really caught flat-footed. Like I did not understand the ideological contours. I didn't even know BreadTube really. And I didn't understand the ideological contours of this kind of emerging Zoomer leftism. So my question is, again, mainly for Rebekah, but others as well, what are the ideological contours there? What are the chief obstacles? And pedagogically, how do you approach Zoomer generation people who are being politicized in this environment?
It's been weird. It's one of the first things, I think, since my first convention that I've tried to bring up in different ways, and it's great that the first in-person convention is about liberalism, because I think, it's kind of weird. Maybe it was easier for me because I was never introduced to freedom as like a right-wing thing. For me, it was, it was like more of almost a spiritual thing, but it was never something I was afraid of. It was always something very positive and like constantly self-transforming. It's like, but strangely enough, I think the way that most people learn about, bourgeois society is as a mistake. And that's what actually what this convention has captured, weirdly, because this is, the people we have on the panel are the pedagogical figures of the Zoomer generation. And they've completely flattened the bourgeois revolution into just, another mistake in the chain of humanity. And the thing is, I'm really scared teaching new recruits about the bourgeois, like both scared but also excited, right? Because honestly, like I love the Marx and Lenin and Frankfurt school, but like and that's kind of why I read out this quote, like the most powerful readings that I've done in Platypus are from the bourgeois revolution. And I always just try to be really, I just want them to feel it. I want them to read Abbe, I want them to read Rousseau, Adam Smith, Hegel, and just Kant, and just feel that this is a qualitative change in history that we cannot comprehend from our point of time, and that we have to really humble ourselves to that fact, to the fact of the bourgeois revolution. And I've managed to do that with my recruits, and contacts, right? Because I was expecting them to just reject it. And the thing is, like, they might accept it on a few different layers and reject it on other layers. But that's still, for me, I think once I made that breakthrough of, like, how are we on bourgeois enlightenment and the difference between, bourgeois society and capitalism, that non-identity, which is key to Platypus, and Platypus is one of the only organizations now that actively pushes that line. I just really, somehow that's still translating to people. The way I do it is just like really try to emphasize to them what this moment is, emphasize the historical context, that this is just like an incredible qualitative change, and that like we have to humble ourselves to history and be conscious of our own inertia and take it for grantedness of what that meant. And that's what I tell my students. I'm just like, look, this is huge, and it's the only way out.
I just want to say something quickly. I think I make Rebekah's words my own. And this is a very similar experience that I have. But the only thing that I would add that I sing is something that actually Aaron Hager taught me, which is that it's actually, there's no problem if people are coming to this reading group and they will do this entire syllabus and they will not want to do Marxism or not want to agree with it. I mean, and so my point is that a big obstacle I think that I face is that a lot of the Gen Z that come into the read group, they think I'm trying to convince them of Marxism, and I'm not trying to convince them of Marxism, right? I want them to learn what it is. I mean, but if they disagree with it, I mean, that's great. At least they know what they're disagreeing with. And so I think this goes back to this authoritarianism, which is like any sort of conversation. Like you can't have a disagreement. If we're talking about this, then you have to agree with me or not. Like we can't just disagree. And so I think that is something that I've seen a lot in this like TikTok, Gen Z left. I don't know, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. So the Frankfurt chapter, myself included, like the members who have been recruited in the last 3 years are basically my generation, and mostly similar, at least no previous engagement with the left, and mostly previously only online. And so my own experience, and also with others who joined later, is that we are so confused and exhausted most of the time that because Platypus has this coherent, let's say, rational pedagogy and approach, this cool-headed approach, that this actually very quickly dissolves at least the first resistance. Of course, then it takes most of the time it takes like half a year or a year so that they then can think about becoming a member. But their first, let's say, angry reactions to some of what we tell them very quickly dissolve, because the pedagogues are very sure, they at least know, what we are to be. We at least know what we know and what we don't know. And again, this cool-headed approach, and so that very quickly dissolves. It's an atmosphere, a space in all of our activities that really helps this. I think, of course, the analogy again is really maybe not so perfect, but I have to think about Adorno's Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda, where he says that the masses perform their own enthusiasm, and if they would just stop for a second to reason, it would all just blow up, so to speak. So I think that's similar in that situation. Yeah, I think that's all. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one more thing about YouTube, and also about the project of Platypus as we do microhistory, and I think this is maybe something we kind of maybe missed out on. When I was watching YouTube or BreadTube, there's an argument over what should be called, because BreadTube is in reference to Kropotkin. And so some people call it RedTube, they're more like the communists. Anyway, so if you're a communist, you call it RedTube. If you're more of an anarchist, you call it RedTube. But actually when I was watching these YouTubers, they were predominantly social democrats. and they were all like pro Corbyn or pro Bernie Sanders. Right, that was their thing. Now they're like hardcore Stalinist, right? And they're like telling kids that, you know, the liberal, again, just kind of what we're seeing in the panels these past couple days. It's like they flattened the bourgeois revolution into just like a mistake of like colonialism and bloody empire and you know, and all these other symptoms of like anti-Americanism. Just like comes to the fore in the most virulent way. So it's actually changed since I was watching Breadstone, because I don't anymore. It's actually expanded and degraded. I was expanded and degraded over the past like 5 years, because it's and you know fallout of Corbyn and Bernie. It changed that sphere too. It changed the way that kids are educated on the internet.
Okay, guys, we're gonna take 3 comments together and then have some final remarks, and we can have a short break and then begin our business meeting proper. It's going to be Erin, then Ethan, and then Zaid. Where's Zaid?
Oh, he's...
Okay, Erin and then Ethan.
Okay, great. Rosa, I really like how you kind of outlined, I don't know, the symptoms that you acquired from activism, anti-Americanism, feminism, and authoritarianism. I think also anti-racism kind of goes into that, but maybe because you're from Brazil, it took it in a different form. You know, I was struck by how much of your experiences were actually very similar to mine. I think I'm a couple of years older than you guys. I'm 25. You know, Rebekah, I was on Tumblr in 2014. I experienced the ambivalence of kind of realizing that there was this group that would like to welcome me in if I followed all the right rules, but that they were also kind of fucking crazy. And being at UChicago has kind of reminded me of the experience of being an undergrad doing Platypus. This is where I did it. It was in this room that Eleanor Gilbert told me that Lenin wanted revolutionaries to sleep on a bed of nails, and so I should stop sounding like a Leninist. And the Trump election made it very difficult. I think a lot of us at UChicago felt a lot of pressures. I remember trying to attend a Palestinian rights like event, just to attend a left event, and they wanted to force like this T-shirt onto me, and they wanted me to like paint the Palestine flag on my face, and I had to like say no, and it was very, very, very awkward. You know, there's a lot of pressures coming from professors. I remember having a meeting with the head of the history department where he started asking me what I thought about Trump.
Quiet down a bit, please.
And I, you know, told the truth, and I could see people staring at me. I could see my professors who were in the department staring at me. And it was very hard for other undergraduates in Platypus. Sometimes it was hard for us to, I think, especially when we first joined, many of us didn't always know or feel comfortable saying we were in Platypus. There were many, many social pressures from our peers and our teachers, and it was difficult, and Trump made it more difficult. We really had to stand up to tremendous pressures. I mean, I remember telling my parents about it, and my mom telling me, you just have to not listen to these people, and I'm proud that I have a daughter who doesn't listen to what the crowd tells her to do. But it's hard, and I was wondering how those pressures have changed, what pressures you all have felt trying to do Platypus on campus, because that is something that you just encounter, and how you've been able to maybe use it. Because I do think that people are open. As much as they're closed, people are open too. I'm not trying to be a downer, but you know, what pressures have you experienced, and how have you tried to turn them into assets that you can use to do Platypus?
All right, Ethan, and then we are going to add Max right at the back, just for the final.
Can you hear me? All right. Yes. So I feel like this is directed to all the panelists. We were sort of myself and you guys, we were recruited and sort of had our education in Platypus at around a similar moment. You know, this sort of late millennial recognition of its own death, you know, the downturn of the Sanders campaign in 2020, et cetera. And my question is, that it kind of adds on to what you were saying. How has Platypus clarified, or has it clarified, sort of the despair, the reaction to the downturn, the millennial left, specifically from Gen Z? Like, you know, it's sort of something that came up in the panels today, and the reaction to liberalism is, you know, this sort of knee-jerk sort of recognition of the failure of the millennial left. How has Platypus sort of clarified this historical moment, this despair for each of you individually, and how do you approach it with context.
And Max.
Can you guys hear me all right?
No.
Okay, there it is. I think unfortunately my comment kind of loops into a similar thing, and also unfortunately I want to qualify this with a bit of a personal anecdote. I think my engagement with the left is a bit different because I was a proverbial red diaper baby. My parents were socialists, they were on the left, albeit not necessarily coming from a Marxist tradition. I think this comment might come across a bit odious to some of the people here, but my first conscious engagement with leftism was the Sermon on the Mount, that kind of American Christian socialism tradition. And I did get engagement with Marx and Marxism and became a Marxist in, I guess, my mid-adolescent years, like a lot of people. And I'm a true believer in the project, but one thing that I've really come across in the convention and Platypus in general, well, they do have a reading of Marx and a reading of the Frankfurt School and Lenin and Trotsky that I do agree with. But one thing about it is it almost seems, if not pessimistic, pretty harrowing for the prospects of the left and a leftist future. And this comes from a bit of a, I guess not worry, but a place of concern. How do you guys overcome this, and how do you see us overcoming this, or is it just as bad as it looks?
It's worse.
We don't guys,
Just
fine. Do you want to try and wrap up some responses to those on
I'm going to be quick. So actually in Frankfurt, the only thing that's like pressure on us, or like pressure, not really, because of we just can't use one of the 2 or 3 student cafes on campus as an organization because of the translation of the very horrible and transphobic article by you, David Hayes. So, thank you for that. Whatever.
That's crazy. That's crazy, though.
Yeah,
that's
but
crazy.
Well, we have other places to go, so many other places. So whatever, they can keep their little.
You got expelled from university.
No.
But
It's a cafe. How do you say? Self-administered by students, and just some small room there, and not expelled. Just basically we said we are not welcome as an organization. At least they are so nice to say as individuals you can sit here, but not like do coffee breaks or so on. It's better. There are worse things. So actually the left in Frankfurt is kind of very open right now to, I think, to our project. So, but it's still difficult to really like get a sense of that because we were, 2 years or 1.5 years in lockdown, not really in Frankfurt, but on Zoom. And so the last semester when we did a lot of engagement with the left was more or less curiosity, like, okay, interesting by all of these different people, yeah. And and unfortunately, I can't, I don't have an answer to the second question. I'm very sorry for that. And the last one, no pessimism, optimism. Well, I don't know. As Stefan has said, it works. We are getting there. Like, how can I say this? I think the rest of the left is more pessimist about themselves, but they won't admit it, of course. They don't think socialism is possible. We at least think that maybe it could be possible. So, just how do I overcome it? I just get stuff done in Frankfurt, more or less. I don't want to say I'm doing all of this. Tom, Jonas, and so on. All of my great friends and comrades in Frankfurt are doing a great job, and we just keep on working. Basically that. Yeah.
I'm just gonna follow on. So starting from the last question from Max, I remember at the end. So I performed pedagogue duties last year from the beginning to the end. So from the bourgeois radicals down to the Frankfurt school. And I remember at the end of it, I was just, and again, it might have also been because it was like lockdown was ending for the United Kingdom after like 5 months, which is like no human being should be put under that kind of containment. It was genuinely horrible. So it's kind of like as the world is opening back up and I'm able to like meet people again face to face. We were reading the Frankfurt School, and I just had like a weird psychological break. I was just kind of like, how do we get out of this? Even with Adorno and Benjamin, I was kind of talking about this with Efraim last night. It's like we live in a post-Holocaust world where the Holocaust is kind of repeating itself. We live in barbarism. How do we get out of it? And that's when I actually turned to Evan Odell, and I just messaged him. I was like, I'm having a really bad time. Like, I've just finished Adorno and Benjamin, and I'm everything's really ambiguous, and I don't know like the way out of it. And he's like, well, what we can rely on is just like it's 1848. It's like we're, or at least maybe even that bets off. But I think at least. The wager is that Marxism still stands because we're still in the crisis of bourgeois society, of bourgeois right, and that will keep repeating itself. And what's the difference being is how can we clarify the left's task to point beyond itself? As I said, because that was the other big lesson, was that like the left, when it is not clarified to itself, it just reconstitutes capitalism. It's the vanguard for capitalism over and over again. Sorry, to the other questions, and I know I'm taking up a lot of time. Doing platypus at undergrad was really difficult. But I think especially if you're doing, and I know most of you guys are like social science majors, because of course we are. But we, again, especially Gen Zers, but you still get it in the millennials, but also I remember the first digital convention, Spencer saying something about this, that the way that society is now, just like politics and personal life are completely merged. So like you cannot relate to each other on the basis of anything but politics. So when I, started doing platypus, it's like my relationships with my friends, they changed. And for some people, they just wouldn't talk to me anymore. And that was extremely difficult. It's like for some people, and actually I was not some, most people, and it's unfortunate because I know like the organizers of, the people that founded this organization maybe don't want to hear this, but it's something that we push through anyway because we care about the project. But it is a very emotional process doing platypus because you do lose friends sometimes at a very vulnerable point in your life. And then to the other question, how has platypus clarified the despair of the millennial left to Gen Z? I would say at the moment, and I think again, like with this convention, we're starting to do that very well. I think in terms of just raising back this micro history of like turns of like idealism, materialism, this kind of like this utopian turn, this materialist turn. I think it's like knowing that this isn't new, that it's actually, this happens all the time. And the history kind of like has this grain to it. I think that's the way that, at least for me, that the failure of the millennial left is being clarified. Because I think I joined Platypus like after the declaration of the end of the millennial left, right? It already happened, and I didn't experience. And I'd like to talk to you guys about it. Just like I didn't experience that death of the millennial left after a lot of hope was put into it. But the thing is, like, Platypus is still great. It's like, and that clarification is still very, very useful and very, very worthwhile, and we can learn from it.
Okay, so I guess I'll try to answer all these questions. So in terms of the pressures that Aaron was asking about, I think that because I'm in the academia world, especially in the specific academic world that I am in, I think it's been very difficult. I daily remember something that Spencer said in the reading group, I think, which was, Marxism will not give you any friends. Marxism will not help your career. Yes, and you just, that's true. So there's a daily reminder of that to me. In school, I mean, I've been called a Republican because, I want masks to be optional, So I think that one of the pressures here is this sort of intolerance. And so in the same way that Platypus taught me tolerance, it also showed me the intolerance. That it's not just me being intolerant. Actually, there's a whole, the conditions that we're living in is of intolerance, at least in my experience. And also, there's this pessimism, I think, that Lucas was talking about, in terms of, people actually, they don't believe in socialism anymore. I mean, they really don't. I mean, they don't want it to happen. I think, the people in New York know. I have this professor who thinks that there's literally no possibility for anything because the climate crisis is ruin everything. So we can't have socialism.
We deserve we deserve the climate crisis, right? That's like the humanity deserves this. We did it to ourselves.
Right,
that's the worst of it.
With the white supremacists, we did this. And so in terms of the clarification of the despair, I think that, as I said, this tolerance that I've learned, it's actually given me a lot of patience and sympathy for the left that I'm encountering on campus and stuff, because I can put myself in their shoes. It's like I understand where they are. I understand how they think that the way that they think, because I was there too. And so that's really helpful. And so it's actually, at the same time, it's very hopeful, because I'm like, oh, I was there too. I sort of understand where you are. So it's easier not to give up on someone just because they're not agreeing with you, which is something that I think I used to do a lot. But in terms of overcoming the despair more generally, I think that, at least to me, having a fuller understanding of like the historical consciousness aspect really got rid of my despair. It really clarified my despair, because, as I said in my initial remarks, I didn't really have a conception of history. I didn't really have any of this. And so that put things into perspective in a way that, the despair seems so immediate, sort of thing. And so, as I said, then it's easier to deal with others' despairs, because it's like, I also see how the lack of this historical consciousness and like its importance. And it's that thing, going over it over all the time. And I think we in the recent discussions we talked about also how it's always, we're going back to the beginning all the time. Going back to the beginning all the time. You really have to do that. But another pressure I think that I wanted to talk about in terms of this pessimism that I mentioned is that I think that there's a very big aversion to the word utopia, and I think and it's always in the back of, I'm really glad that we do the Kolakowski reading, because that's really when that's when I understood the utopia that matters for us. And I guess, and I've gotten a lot in with my professors, as I said, like I've been really having this pushback. The people in New York know a lot. I really have this pushback against my professors because they criticize me for being a utopian. They say you're in a derogatory sense, like that's a bad thing for them. And so it's just, now I'm not scared of being a utopian, in Kolakowski's sense of it. And so I think that that's really good to keep not only the critical recognition, something that Aaron always talks about, but also keeping this hope. It's always like when people talk about Platypus being this pessimistic project, I actually think it's so hopeful. But Yeah, I think that just to reiterate something that was said, I guess in the end, the only way to really overcome the despair, not only on ourselves, because I think it's a constant process of overcoming, even with ourselves, but also, with the people that we encounter, it is by doing it. We gotta keep, it is a practical thing. We have to be doing this all the time, because the despair could be, although they continue, it seems like they're also different, and so there's always different learning opportunities, and so it's by having this constant pushback with, in academia, because that's the realm that I'm sort of in, and like doing this all the time, that I guess that helps me overcome it. But yeah, I guess I think the most important thing to me is just this matter of not being scared of being a utopia. I think that's something that I keep holding on to.